The Helmet's Whisper, 30 Years of Buried Truth. Chapter 1, The Echo in the Dust, October 2025. The autumn air in Beckley, West Virginia, hung heavy with the scent of damp earth and distant wood smoke, a familiar balm to my weary soul. I am Sarah Bennett, 55 years old, and my life has been etched by loss, defined by a single catastrophic event that occurred exactly 3 decades ago. My small, modest home, nestled among the rolling hills that once hummed with the pulse of coal mines, was a sanctuary, a shrine to a past that refused to fade. 30 years ago, when I was a mere 25, my world imploded. My husband, Daniel, vibrant and full of life at the same age, was swallowed by the earth, a victim of a horrific mining accident. He left behind a gaping void in my heart and our 2-year-old son, Michael. Since that day, my life has been a relentless, uphill climb. I worked 2, sometimes 3 jobs, cleaning houses, waiting tables, doing whatever it took to keep a roof over our heads and food on the table. My focus was singular: Michael. To raise him, to protect him, to give him a future far removed from the dark, dangerous bowels of the earth that had claimed his father. I never remarried. How could I? My heart, shattered into a million pieces, had been buried with Daniel in the cold, unforgiving earth. Grief was my constant companion, a silent, heavy shroud, but beneath the profound sorrow lay something far more insidious, a secret companion that had burrowed deep into my soul: guilt. All these years, I had clung to the narrative of an unfortunate accident, a sudden, unpredictable collapse, a tragic twist of fate. But a persistent, insidious whisper had always lingered in the quiet corners of my mind. Could it have been avoided? Were corners cut? Was there something more? The mine, the old Blackwood Coal Company, where Daniel had worked, had closed down abruptly after the disaster, leaving a ghost town of memories and unanswered questions. Michael, now a strapping 30-year-old engineer, lived in another state, a testament to my tireless efforts. He visited when he could, a loving son, though he carried the faint, hazy memory of a father he barely knew. He had come home this particular weekend, his presence a comforting warmth in the quiet house. "Mom," he said, walking into the living room, a large, battered cardboard box tucked under his arm. "Got a call from the old mining archive. You know, the one they're finally dismantling. They found some of Dad's personal effects. Thought they were lost forever." My breath hitched. My hands, usually steady from years of hard work, trembled as he set the box on the worn coffee table. Personal effects. Daniel's. After all this time. It felt like an intrusion, a resurrection. I reached in, my fingers brushing against the rough fabric of his old work shirt, the faded denim of his jeans. Each item, a ghost. Then my hand closed around something solid, heavy, yet strangely familiar: his mining helmet. I lifted it out, slowly, reverently. It was battered, stained with years of coal dust and something else, something dark and unidentifiable. A relic, a sacred, painful relic. The lamp, once shining bright, was shattered. The visor was cracked, but it was his. The very helmet he had worn on his last shift, the one that had gone down with him. I ran my fingers over its surface, tracing the contours of the plastic, feeling the weight of his final moments. And then my finger brushed against something inside, something tucked into the rough, sweat-stained padding of the helmet's interior. A folded piece of paper, yellowed, brittle, hidden. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, desperate rhythm. Michael watched me, his brow furrowed with concern. My hands shook uncontrollably as I carefully extracted the paper. It was small, folded into a tight square. I unfolded it, my vision blurring. The words, his handwriting, bold, familiar. A script I hadn't seen in 3 decades, yet instantly recognizable. It was Daniel's. I read, my eyes devouring each word, each cruel, devastating truth. Sarah, if you find this, they knew. The supports were weak. I told them, don't tell Michael. My fault for going, forgive me. The world spun. They knew. My fault for going, forgive me. It wasn't an accident, not a twist of fate. It was a lie, a deliberate, calculated lie. Daniel hadn't died due to a random collapse. He had died because someone, somewhere, had known, had been warned, and had chosen profit over human life. And he, Daniel, my gentle, loving husband, had carried the burden of that knowledge, even in his final moments. He had tried to warn me, and he had blamed himself. 30 years. 30 years of buried grief, of unspoken questions, of silent guilt, all built on a foundation of sand, on a lie. The air left my lungs in a ragged gasp. The helmet clattered to the floor. Michael rushed forward, his face etched with alarm, but I barely registered him. My mind reeled. The ghost of Daniel, not a victim of circumstance, but of gross negligence, stood before me. His final words, etched in faded ink, screaming a truth that would shatter my carefully constructed peace and ignite a fire I never knew I still possessed. Chapter 2. Echoes of Betrayal. The note lay on the coffee table between Michael and me, a fragile, yellow testament to a devastating truth. I stared at it, my mind a whirlpool of grief, fury, and an overwhelming sense of betrayal. Not just by them, whoever they were, but by the universe itself. 30 years. 30 years I had carried the burden of a tragic accident, the fate of bad luck. 30 years I had silently, subconsciously blamed myself for his death, for not seeing the signs, for letting him go. And all this time, the truth, in Daniel's own hand, lay hidden. Michael picked up the note, his face a mask of confusion. "Mom, what is this? What does it mean?" They knew. He looked up, his eyes wide with alarm, seeing the raw agony etched on my face. I snatched the note back, clutching it to my chest as if it were a fragile bird about to take flight. "Nothing, Michael. It's just something old. Don't worry about it." My voice was sharp, a desperate attempt to protect him, to protect the fragile memory of his father from this brutal accident. Ugly truth. He remembered Daniel as a hero, a loving, brave miner. How could I shatter that image with the grim reality of corporate greed and deliberate negligence? But my internal world was a tempest. Daniel, my Daniel. I saw him vividly, his broad smile, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he laughed, his strong, calloused hands, so gentle when he held Michael, the way he smelled of coal dust and honest sweat after a shift, the warmth of his embrace. He loved mining. It was in his blood, the lifeblood of Beckley, but he also worried. Flashes of memory, long suppressed, began to surface. Daniel, tired after a long shift, occasionally grumbling about cheap shortcuts or management pushing too hard. "They're cutting corners, Sarah," he'd said once, his brow furrowed. making us work in sections that don't feel right. I told old man Morgan, but he just laughed it off. I had dismissed it then, with a young wife's naive trust in authority. In the safety of the established order, just a miner's grumbles, I thought. Everyone complains about work. Oh God, the guilt was a suffocating blanket. He had told me, and I hadn't listened. The next few days were a blur of restless nights and agonizing introspection. The note was hidden under my mattress, a dangerous secret that burned a hole in my heart. I couldn't share it with Michael, not yet. He had idealized his father, constructed a brave, stoic figure from the few fragmented memories and the stories I had carefully curated for him. To expose the truth, to reveal Daniel as a victim of a system that knew and yet chose greed. It felt like a betrayal of Michael's innocence, a desecration of his father's memory. But the anger, a cold, searing flame, grew. It demanded action. I couldn't let Daniel's last words remain a silent cry in the dark. They knew. Who were they? What could I do? A widow pushing 60 against a faceless corporation, against a past that had been buried for decades. I started small. I visited the dusty, forgotten corners of Beckley, the old diners where miners once gathered, their faces grimed with coal dust and fatigue. The worn-out general store where they bought their lunch pails. I asked quiet questions, tentatively, hesitantly. My questions were met with polite evasion, nervous glances, and a universal desire to simply forget. The mining community was tight-knit, bound by unspoken loyalties and a deep-seated fear of reprisal. Miners, even retired ones, knew the power of the coal companies, their long reach into every corner of their lives. Then, one afternoon, sitting alone in a small diner, a voice from a nearby booth caught my attention. "Remember old Daniel Bennett? God, that was a damn shame. Good man, shouldn't have happened." I turned. Two old men, their faces etched with the lines of hard labor, their voices raspy with miners' coughs, sat nursing cups of coffee. One of them I recognized, Graham Wilson. He had worked with Daniel. He had been in the mine that day. He had survived. My heart hammered. This was my chance. I gathered my courage, the note a burning presence under my shirt. I approached their table, my voice trembling. "Mr. Wilson? Graham? It's Sarah Bennett, Daniel's wife." He looked up, his eyes clouded by cataracts and exhaustion, widened in recognition. His face, already pale, seemed to drain of all color. He looked away quickly, his gaze flickering nervously towards his companion. "Sarah, my word, it's been a long time." His voice was strained, thick with unspoken discomfort. His companion, seeing the tension, mumbled an excuse and quickly left. Graham sat alone, his coffee untouched, his hands clasped tightly on the table. He looked sick. His breathing was shallow, punctuated by a rasping cough. He was a shadow of the man I remembered. "Graham," I began, my voice low, urgent. "I found something. Daniel's helmet. And this." I pulled out the yellowed note, unfolding it slowly. I pushed it across the table towards him. His eyes, wary and haunted, fixed on the faded script. As he read, his face paled further. A tremor ran through his frail body. He knew. He had always known. And now the truth, so carefully buried, was rising from the depths, demanding to be seen. Chapter 3. The Weight of Silence. Graham Wilson's hands trembled as he stared at Daniel's note. His eyes, bloodshot and shadowed, lifted to meet mine. In their depths, I saw not just recognition, but a profound, overwhelming guilt. The decades of silence, of suppressed memory, were finally cracking under the weight of Daniel's dying words. "My God, Sarah," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the clatter of the diner. He kept this. He hid it," I corrected, my voice firm. "And now I've found it. Graham, what does it mean? What happened? They knew? Who knew?" My questions were relentless, tearing at the carefully constructed wall he had built around his memories. He closed his eyes, a shudder running through him. "Daniel, he was right. Always. He always had a good eye for safety. He saw it weeks before. The timbers, the roof supports, they were rotting, hairline cracks. He told Foreman Jenkins. He told the shift boss Miller. He even tried to talk to Mr. Morgan himself." My breath caught. Mr. Morgan, David Morgan, the big boss, the director of the Blackwood Coal Company, the man who had been a titan in Beckley, whose family name was synonymous with coal. "They told him to shut up," Graham continued, his voice hoarse, a painful confession. "Told him he was being a worrywart. Said there was no budget for unnecessary repairs. Said production quotas had to be met. Said if he didn't like it, there were 100 other men who'd take his place." He coughed, a deep, rattling sound that shook his frail frame. "We all knew, Sarah, or we suspected." The air felt off. The ground shifted more. There were whispers, but no one dared speak up too loudly. Not in this town. Blackwood owned everything. They owned our jobs, our houses, our futures. If you spoke out, you were blackballed. Your family starved. We were trapped. So we worked, and we prayed. And we stayed silent. His eyes, filled with torment, met mine. Daniel, he was braver than all of us. He kept pushing. The day before, the day of the accident, he refused to go into that section. Said it was a death trap. Jenkins told him he'd be fired. Daniel, he had Michael, you know? He loved that boy more than life itself. He couldn't risk losing his job. So he went in. And then the ground just came down. So fast, like God himself was tearing the earth apart. Tears streamed down Graham's face, mingling with the coal dust etched into his skin. I was lucky. I was further back, but I heard it, the roar, the screams, and I knew. We all knew. It wasn't an accident. It was murder. Slow, deliberate, and we kept silent. Forgive me, Sarah. Forgive us for not helping him, for not speaking up. His confession was a powerful, devastating validation. The guilt, the years of suppressed rage exploded within me. Daniel wasn't just a victim of an accident. He was a victim of corporate greed, of a system that valued profit over people, and of a community silenced by fear. My grief was no longer passive sorrow. It was an active, burning desire for justice. Not for money, not for revenge, but for Daniel's truth, for his sacrifice, for the decades of lies. Thank you, Graham, I said, my voice choked with emotion. Thank you for telling me. It changes everything. There was an investigation, you know, Graham continued, wiping his eyes with a trembling hand. But it was a whitewash. Company paid off a few people, blamed it on unforeseen geological conditions. But there was one man, the state inspector, Mr. Thomas. He was a good man, thorough. He poked around, asked too many questions. I heard he was forced to retire soon after. He might have seen something. A new lead, a thread of hope in the darkness. I paid for Graham's coffee, thanked him again, and left the diner, my mind reeling. My quiet, grieving life was over. The fight, I realized, had just begun. Back home, Michael, ever perceptive, had noticed my agitation, my sudden bursts of energy, my long, haunted silences. He found me poring over old newspaper clippings, faded reports of the Blackwood coal disaster. "Mom," he said, his voice gentle, "what's going on?" "You've been different since I brought that box." I looked at him, my heart aching. How could I tell him? How could I shatter the innocent memory of his father? "It's nothing, honey, just old memories." He wasn't convinced. One night, while I slept, he quietly searched my room. He found the note, hidden beneath my mattress. He read it. The next morning, his face was pale, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and fury. "Mom," he yelled, the note clutched in his hand. "What is this?" "Why didn't you tell me?" "Dad, he knew? It wasn't an accident? You knew this all these years?" His voice was laced with a raw, almost childish betrayal. "No," I cried, tears streaming down my face. "Not all these years, Michael. I just found it, and I didn't tell you because I wanted to protect you, to protect his memory. What would knowing this have done to you as a boy? It would have destroyed you." We argued, the decades of unspoken pain erupting between us. He accused me of shielding him, of robbing him of the truth, of the right to grieve properly. I accused him of not understanding the burden I had carried, the impossible choice I had faced. But underneath the anger, a deeper truth began to emerge. A shared pain, a shared desire for justice. After hours of tears and accusations, the storm finally broke. We sat in silence, exhausted, but with a new, fragile understanding. "Mom," Michael said, his voice softer, "we have to do something. We can't let this stand. Dad, he deserves justice." My son, my purpose. He was ready. Together, we would find Mr. Thomas. Together, we would uncover the truth. Daniel's last whisper would finally be heard. Chapter 4: The Archivist of Truth. Finding Mr. Thomas wasn't easy. He was a ghost in the annals of time, a name whispered in old newspaper clippings, long forgotten by the modern world. Michael, with his engineer's methodical mind and 21st century research skills, finally tracked him down to a quiet, unassuming nursing home tucked away in the more rural parts of West Virginia. The journey there was solemn, filled with the weight of our shared mission. Michael drove, his jaw set, his presence a comforting, unwavering support. The anger in him had solidified into a quiet determination, mirroring my own. We found Mr. Thomas in a sunlit room, surrounded by faded photographs and the scent of lavender and old paper. He was frail, his body ravaged by time, but his eyes, behind thick spectacles, were remarkably clear, sharp with the wisdom of a long life. "Mr. Thomas?" I asked gently, standing beside his wheelchair. "My name is Sarah Bennett. This is my son Michael. My husband, Daniel Bennett, died in the Blackwood coal disaster 30 years ago." His eyes widened slightly, a flicker of recognition. "Bennett," he murmured, his voice reedy, yet distinct. "Yes, a good man, a terrible day. I remember." My heart hammered. He remembered. I pulled out Daniel's note, the yellowed paper now fragile from my handling. "We found this, Mr. Thomas, in his helmet." I handed it to him. He took it, his gnarled fingers surprisingly delicate. He read the words, his gaze fixed on Daniel's familiar script. His face, already pale, seemed to drain of all remaining color. A single tear tracked a path down his wrinkled cheek. "Daniel," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. He was so brave. He tried to tell them. He tried to warn them. He looked up at me, his eyes filled with a decades-old burden of guilt. "They knew, Mrs. Bennet. Blackwood Coal knew. I suspected it then. I knew it in my gut. But I couldn't prove it. Not officially." He then recounted the investigation, how he, as the state mining inspector, had meticulously documented every detail, how he had found evidence of neglected timber supports, of ignored safety warnings, how Daniel Bennett's complaints, dismissed as miners grumbling, were carefully recorded in the daily logs, only to be later lost. "I was close, Mrs. Bennet," he said, his voice gaining strength, infused with a righteous anger that had simmered for decades. "So close. I had copies of internal reports, maintenance logs that showed scheduled repairs were skipped, memos from Daniel and other miners about unsafe conditions. But the company, they had powerful lawyers and friends in high places. They put immense pressure on my superiors. They called it unforeseen geological conditions. It was a lie, a damned lie, and they got away with it." He confessed his own guilt. "I fought, Mrs. Bennet. I truly did. But they threatened my pension, my reputation. They said they'd make sure I'd never work again. They made sure my reports disappeared. I was a single man. I had no family to protect. I should have fought harder. I should have exposed them. I'm so sorry, so profoundly sorry." His words confirmed everything. The note, Graham's testimony, the pieces of the puzzle were finally fitting together, forming a horrifying picture of corporate malfeasance and systemic cover-up. David Morgan, the name echoed in my mind, the ultimate architect of this injustice. "Mr. Thomas?" Michael interjected, his voice firm. "Did you keep anything? Any copies? Any proof?" Mr. Thomas's eyes gleamed with a sudden, shrewd light. He leaned closer, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "I did. I suspected they'd try to bury everything. I was old school, didn't trust computers. I made physical copies, duplicate reports, memos. I even copied a few internal company emails. Printed them out from a disgruntled secretary's trash bin. I knew what I had." My heart leaped. "Where are they, Mr. Thomas?" I urged, leaning forward, barely daring to breathe. He paused, a faint smile touching his lips, a touch of his old, tenacious self. "I didn't trust anyone, not even the archives. Figured they'd find a way to make them disappear there too. This town, it runs on coal, runs on money. I hid them, in plain sight almost, in the old public library, the one that closed down years ago. In a box, encrypted in a way. I marked it, my own little secret." He then gave us a series of cryptic clues, a specific shelf number, a peculiar Dewey Decimal classification, a hidden compartment behind a loose brick. It was like a treasure hunt, a final act of defiance from an old man determined to see justice done. He looked at me, his gaze unwavering. "Find them, Mrs. Bennet. Expose them. For Daniel. For all the Daniels." We left the nursing home, a whirlwind of emotions swirling within me. Hope, determination, and a fierce, burning resolve. We had the truth. We had the evidence. Now we just needed to retrieve it. And then we would fight. Not just for Daniel, but for every life lost, every family broken, every truth buried in the name of corporate greed. The long-awaited reckoning was finally at hand. Chapter 5. The Unearthing and the Reckoning. The old Beckley Public Library was a crumbling monument to a bygone era. Its windows were boarded up, its facade scarred by time and neglect. Dust motes danced in the sparse beams of light that pierced through cracks in the decaying roof. The air was thick with the scent of damp paper, mildew, and forgotten stories. It was the perfect place for a secret to lie hidden for decades. Michael, armed with Mr. Thomas's cryptic clues and his own innate engineering logic, led the way. We moved through the silent, echoing halls, our footsteps muffled by layers of dust. Each empty shelf, each dark corner, seemed to whisper tales of lives once lived, of knowledge once sought. Now it was a tomb of forgotten wisdom. "All right," Michael said, consulting a faded note he'd meticulously transcribed from Mr. Thomas's jumbled phrases. He said, "Section G, Shelf 4. Between the forgotten poets and the history of Appalachia, and the brick behind the bust of Walt Whitman." We navigated through the labyrinthine stacks, the silence pressing in around us. Finally, we located Section G, Shelf 4, between dusty volumes of obscure poetry and forgotten historical texts. And there it was, a small, cracked plaster bust of Walt Whitman, gazing impassively at the ruins of his literary sanctuary. My heart hammered against my ribs. Michael ran his hand along the wall behind the bust, his fingers searching. He pushed, he pulled, and then, with a soft scraping sound, a loose brick gave way, revealing a small, dark cavity. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with rough twine, was a metal box, tarnished, heavy. It felt like holding a piece of history, a physical embodiment of a decades-long injustice. Michael carefully pulled it out. My hands trembled as I watched him. This was it, the key to Daniel's truth. The evidence that could finally bring justice. He struggled with the clasp, rusted shut after years of neglect. Finally, with a grunt, it popped open. Inside, neatly organized, were bundles of documents, yellowed, fragile, but unmistakably official. Internal memos, maintenance reports with specific dates and sections highlighted, handwritten notes from miners' meetings, and amongst them several printed copies of what looked like emails, their dates spanning the weeks leading up to the disaster. They bore the names of mine managers, foremen, and one name that made my blood run cold, David Morgan. We pulled out the documents, our eyes scanning the damning evidence. "Look at this," Michael whispered, his voice thick with a mixture of shock and fury. May 10th, 1995, a memo from Foreman Jenkins to Mr. Morgan stating, "Structural integrity compromised in Section 7. Immediate reinforcement required. Risk of collapse imminent." He flipped another page. And here's a response, dated May 12th, from Morgan's office. Acknowledged. Budget constraints preclude unscheduled repairs. Monitor closely. My hands shook as I read another. The handwritten note, almost illegible, from Daniel. It was a log of his direct complaints to Foreman Jenkins about the decaying timber supports in Section 7. Dated May 15th, the day before the accident. His warnings, ignored, deliberately, for profit. David Morgan. He knew. He had knowingly sent Daniel and all those other men into a death trap. The rage that had simmered for 30 years boiled over, sharp and clear. This wasn't just negligence. This was a crime, a premeditated crime, hidden by corporate power and the silence of a terrified community. We left the library, the heavy box clutched between us, no longer ghosts, But warriors, our path was clear. We would find a lawyer. We would fight. Finding a lawyer willing to take on a 30-year-old case against a powerful conglomerate was daunting. Many balked, citing the statute of limitations, the difficulty of proving intent after so long, the sheer power of the opposing side. But then, Michael, relentless in his pursuit, found her, a young, fiercely intelligent civil rights attorney from Morgantown. Specializing in environmental and corporate negligence cases, her name was Miss Chen. She listened patiently as we recounted our story, as I showed her Daniel's note, as Michael laid out the unearthed documents. Her eyes, initially skeptical, widened with each piece of evidence. "This is extraordinary," she said, her voice hushed. "These documents, if they're authenticated, this changes everything. This isn't just an accident. This is criminal negligence, a cover-up." She agreed to take the case. We filed a civil lawsuit against the conglomerate that had since absorbed Blackwood Coal, and against the surviving former executives, including the now octogenarian David Morgan. The news sent shockwaves through Beckley. The old Blackwood disaster, long buried in the town's collective memory, was suddenly resurrected, dragged into the harsh light of public scrutiny. The ensuing legal battle was long, arduous, and emotionally draining. The conglomerate's lawyers were ruthless, trying to discredit us, to cast doubt on the authenticity of the documents, to paint Mr. Thomas as a senile old man. But we had the truth, and we had Daniel's voice, a whisper from the grave that would now roar in the courtroom. I testified. My voice, usually quiet, resonated with a new, unwavering strength as I spoke of Daniel, of our life, of the pain of his loss, and of the agonizing discovery of his final note. Michael testified, his own pain and conviction palpable. Graham Wilson, frail but determined, gave his testimony, confirming Daniel's warnings and the culture of fear that had silenced the miners. And Mr. Thomas, wheeled into the courtroom, his voice thin but resolute, detailed how he had hidden the documents, defying a corrupt system that had tried to bury the truth. But it was Daniel's note, his last message, that became the centerpiece of our case. Miss Chen, our lawyer, used it to humanize the victims, to expose the cold, calculating nature of the company's greed. Expert witnesses confirmed the structural weaknesses, the skipped maintenance, the direct links between management's decisions and the collapse. The trial lasted for weeks, a grueling exposé of corporate negligence and human cost. The conglomerate tried every trick in the book, but the evidence, so meticulously preserved by Mr. Thomas, was undeniable. The truth finally had nowhere left to hide. Chapter 6. The Unburdening of Truth. The verdict came down like a thunderclap in the packed courtroom. Guilty. The conglomerate that had absorbed Blackwood Coal, along with David Morgan and several other surviving former executives, were found liable for wrongful death and gross negligence. The judge's voice, clear and firm, pronounced their culpability, laying bare the decades of deceit and the callous disregard for human life. A collective gasp swept through the courtroom, followed by a wave of muffled sobs. Mine, Michael's, Graham Wilson, sitting beside us, his eyes closed, tears silently tracing paths through the lines on his face. Mr. Thomas, frail but triumphant, nodded slowly, a quiet vindication after 30 years. It wasn't about the money, not for me, but the financial compensation awarded was substantial. It would never bring Daniel back. It would never erase the pain. But it was a powerful, undeniable declaration. Daniel's life mattered. His warnings mattered, and his death was not in vain. The company was forced to issue a public apology, a televised statement acknowledging their culpability, their systemic failures, and the devastating loss of life. To hear those words, after 3 decades of silence and evasion, was a profound, bittersweet victory. The apology, so long overdue, felt like a balm to my raw, wounded soul. The news spread like wildfire through Beckley. The long-held secrets, the unspoken fears, the simmering resentments, all were finally brought into the light. Other mining families, who had suffered similar losses and felt similar pain, reached out to us, finding a voice, finding validation through Daniel's story. Our lawyer, Ms. Chen, worked tirelessly to ensure that a significant portion of the awarded compensation was allocated to establishing a Daniel Bennett Miner Safety Fund. Its purpose: to advocate for stronger safety regulations, provide support for injured miners, and offer financial assistance to families affected by mining disasters. It was a living legacy, a testament to Daniel's sacrifice, ensuring that his death would, in some way, protect future generations of miners. In the weeks that followed, a profound sense of peace began to settle over me. The suffocating weight of unexpressed grief, of unspoken questions, of that terrible, persistent guilt. It lifted, slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, then with an overwhelming sense of liberation. Daniel's final message in his helmet wasn't just a confession of truth. It was a desperate plea for justice, a silent instruction to unearth the hidden crime. And I had done it. We had done it. My relationship with Michael deepened immeasurably. The shared journey, the uncovering of the truth, the fight for justice, it had forged an unbreakable bond between us. He looked at me with a newfound respect, a profound pride. He knew his father now, not just as a brave miner who died in an accident, but as a man who died fighting for truth, a man whose warnings were deliberately ignored, and whose story finally brought accountability. One crisp autumn afternoon, I drove to the quiet cemetery, a place that had always felt heavy with unspoken sorrow. I stood before Daniel's grave, the weathered headstone of familiar comfort. In my hands, I held his old mining helmet, now clean, his note, framed and protected, lying on top. "Daniel," I whispered, the words carrying on the gentle breeze. "We did it. The truth is out. They know. Everyone knows you were right." I placed the helmet on the rich green grass beside the headstone, and next to it, the framed note. It was no longer a burden, no longer a secret. It was a testament, a symbol of justice, a marker of truth revealed. I stood there for a long time, the sunlight warm on my face, the quiet hum of the West Virginia hills surrounding me. For the first time in 30 years, I felt a lightness in my soul. The tears that came were not of pain, but of profound release. I could finally mourn Daniel, truly, completely, without the heavy shadow of unanswered questions or lingering guilt. He had found his peace, and I, finally, had found mine. My small house in Beckley, once a shrine to a painful past, now felt like a home, filled with new purpose. I became an advocate for miner safety, sharing Daniel's story, speaking at community meetings, working with the fund to ensure no other family would suffer the same fate. My quiet life had found a new, powerful voice. I looked out towards the distant mountains, their peaks shrouded in a soft autumn haze. The darkness of the mines, the shadows of the past, still existed, but they no longer held me captive. Daniel's final message had not just been a secret, it had been a key to unlock the truth, to unlock justice, and to unlock my own long-awaited freedom. My life, finally, was my own, ready for whatever new chapters lay ahead.